Good morning, Mr. Lilly. Court reporter checking in.
Good morning, Ms. Dice. Thank you for letting me know. All right, it looks like, let me just double check. We have one person in the waiting room. All right, it looks like everybody who is trying to join has joined, so we will go ahead and get started. Good morning, my name is Alan Lilly. I'm the presiding hearing officer of the State Water Resources Control Board's Administrative Hearings Office. Today is May 23rd, 2022, and it's just after 9 a.m. This is a continuation of the hearing on the prosecution team's draft cease and desist order against Blue Triton Brands, Inc., which we refer to as Blue Triton. The parties have previously entered their appearances. Is there anybody new who has not appeared before who wants to enter an appearance today? All right, hearing that, I do see a Greg. Greg, could you go off mute so we can put your last name into our participants? I'll just make it easier.
Yes, my name is Allard, E-L-L-O-R-D.
A-L-L-O-R-D. All right, thank you, Mr. Allard. My staff will change your appearance so we have your listing here so we have your full name. All right, and just for a scheduling matter, a warning, I do have to take a break today from 2 o'clock until 2:30 for a board member briefing and another matter. I'll just give you a little bit of inside information. When the board members schedule briefings, they don't seem to check anybody else's schedule. They just check their schedules. And of course, I report to them. So I will have to have a break for just that half hour. And as I say, it's in a totally different matter. But other than that, we should be able to go with normal schedule. So before we start our testimony today, I would like to discuss Ms. Belenke's April 29, 2022 email to me, which transmitted a revised version of Exhibit CBD1, which was Mr. Zadone's written proposed testimony. By an email that same day, Mr. Anderson of my office advised Ms. Belenke that she could ask me to accept this revised exhibit into evidence. That's a new CBD exhibit today. So first of all, Ms. Belenke, do you want to offer this revised exhibit into evidence as a new CBD exhibit?
Yes.
And what is the basis for your offer?
Well, the corrections were made in response to the questions asked during the direct and cross-examination. The one is the additional citation that was requested, and Mr. Zadone did not have time to look for it during the hearing. And the other was a clarification, adding the word watershed, which I'm not going to testify as to why, but we could, but it's simply a clarification. And the last is the clarification at the end that the parenthetical was omitted from his quotation. And Mr. Zadone, this doesn't change his testimony at all. It doesn't change any of his conclusions. It's simply a clarification.
All right. And then Ms. Grady, you filed a motion to strike that testimony. Could you please just briefly, and I have read it, so you don't need to go into a lot of detail, but is there anything you would like to add to the written motion to strike that you filed on May 2nd?
There's nothing I would like to add. I think it's detailed in the written papers.
All right, thank you. All right, so I am going to not allow revised exhibit CBD1 into evidence, and I'm going to grant the motion to strike. We really aren't set up in the hearing. This effectively is asking Mr. Zidane to supplement his prior testimony, and he's not here today to do that. We don't have any authentication of his revisions. Of course, we have the attorney statement, but that's it. And I just don't think that's appropriate. These issues were covered on cross-examination, and Ms. Belenke, you did have an opportunity for redirect to seek clarification from him. So that's my ruling on that. And with that, I'm going to go forward with, if I can find my notes here. We will start with Blue Triton's. I don't even know how many sirs we are in rebuttals, so I'm just going to call it additional testimony and exhibits at this point. Blue Triton has filed new exhibits BTB 42 through 46. And Story of Stuff Project has filed new exhibits SOS 288 through SOS 301. The order of proceeding for this additional evidence will be as follows. First, I will have Mr. Nichols and Mr. Grunwald summarize their written proposed testimony in exhibits BTB 42 and 45. And then, of course, we'll have cross-examination and further questions of them regarding those exhibits. Second, we will have Mr. Allard summarize his testimony. His written proposed testimony is in exhibit SOS 288. And obviously he may use his summary slides, which are in exhibit SOS 295 to provide that summary. And then third, we will have Mr. Nichols summarize his written proposed testimony in exhibit SOS 46. So with that, we will go ahead and get started. Mr. Nichols, good morning. Just as a reminder, you still are under the oath you previously took in this hearing. I know it was quite a while ago, but I'm sure you remember that. And I will just ask, is exhibit BTB 42 your, I'll just say, additional testimony for this hearing?
I believe it is. I didn't review the actual exhibit number of the testimony I submitted, but I believe so.
Okay, trust me. It says at the top, written sir rebuttal testimony of Mark Nichols. So I will assume that is your testimony. And that's your first round of testimony, which responds or rebuts testimony given by Mr. Eggers and Mr. Lowe for this hearing. So which Blue Triton attorney is going to ask Mr. Nichols the questions regarding its summary of its testimony?
That will be me, Mr. Lilly.
All right, Ms. Grady, you may proceed. It's 9:09. We've obviously covered this matter in considerable detail, so we don't need any particular background. So with that, I'm going to allow you 15 minutes to ask Mr. Nichols questions, which will be limited to asking him to summarize his testimony in exhibit BTB 42. With that, you may proceed.
And I am just going to invite Mr. Nichols to please provide a brief summary of his testimony.
All right, Mr. Nichols, please proceed.
Thank you. I'd like to start by noting that paragraphs 3 and 4 in the document that I submitted were switched. It might help the reader to understand that paragraphs 3 and 4 should be in the opposite order of what they are presented in the document. And with that.
All right, I'll just make a note of that. We're not going to try to change the exhibit, but I'll basically put a note here, read 4 before 3 or something like that.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
So, in particular, I'd like to speak about several topics in Mr. Eggers that were presented in testimony offered by Mr. Eggers. The first of those topics is a permitting authority over water collection beneath the ground surface. Mr. Eggers stated that I was incorrect in a statement that I made in my testimony that water collected by BTB in Strawberry Canyon is collected at points located deep beneath the surface of the earth. And I'm reading from my testimony for that sentence, and therefore would not be subject to the board's water right permitting authority absent diversion from a subterranean stream. This statement from Mr. Eggers is at odds. The fact that he asserts that this is incorrect is at odds with a recent articulation of the four-part test applied by the state board in another matter.
Objection. Mr. Lilly, I believe he's about to test to interpret the law, and I don't think that's appropriate for this witness. And also, we were barred from having somebody testify as to legal interpretation.
Yes, I think, your exhibit doesn't, or your written testimony, Mr. Nichols, doesn't really have any foundation. I assume you must have gotten this brief from your attorneys, but I don't think it's appropriate for you to testify on this legal matter. This is a fine line here. I know Mr. Eggers was talking about the water board's permitting authority, and I think you can testify as to technical facts regarding that. But I think this does cross over the line into a flat-out description of a question of law that you don't have the authority for. So I don't know. That's my initial opinion. I see Mr. Petrozelli's hand. Is that Mr. Petrozelli? Go ahead.
Yeah, and to further, this even more precisely describe Mr. Eggers' testimony. He was essentially summarizing, board decisions on this issue. So,
all right. So,
rather
Ms. Grady,
than,
go ahead.
Excuse me. He was summarizing board decisions on this issue, positions that the board has taken. He wasn't, I would say, providing analysis or, further interpretation.
All right, Ms. Grady, your hand is up. Go ahead.
To clarify, the testimony that Mr. Nichols has offered in his written testimony that he's seeking to summarize at the moment is not.
You might want to slow down a little bit before the court
Thank
reporter gets
you.
angry with you.
Thank you for the reminder. Mr. Nichols' written testimony is not proffered as legal expertise, and he is not interpreting. He is instead offering this in response to the statements made by Mr. Eggers about the board's practice. And this is directly contradictory. And as Mr. Nichols testified and was allowed to testify in the beginning of this proceeding, his analysis was based upon his understanding of the applicable standards. And that was, as he explained, the reason he had looked at the water system the way that he did and the boundaries around which he tried to frame his explanation of his work.
All right. I'm going to sustain the objection. I'm not going to allow paragraph 4 of Mr. Nichols' testimony into evidence. This is of exhibit BTB 42. At this point, this is simply characterizing a position taken by a water board attorney in a court case. This doesn't have anything to do with Mr. Nichols' technical work or his technical expertise. And just so go thinking ahead to this, because I'm sure the issue will come up, I'm not going to allow exhibit BTB 43 into evidence. Ms. Grady, if you think this is going to be relevant to a legal argument that you and your colleagues want to make in your closing brief, you may ask me to take official notice of exhibit BTB 43. I don't know whether or not it is subject to official notice. It's not really an official action of the board. It's an action by a board attorney in court. But I think we need to cut this off at this point about having technical experts talk about legal issues. I mean, as I said before, there's a gray area, and I'm not sure exactly where the line is, but I am pretty sure this is over the line. So let's move on. Mr. Nichols, you may summarize the rest of your testimony, but I'm going to sustain the objection to your testimony in paragraph 4. So please proceed.
Thank you. The next topic is Mr. Eggers testified that I incorrectly claimed that there's no clear evidence indicating where spring orifices may have been located in proximity to tunnels and boreholes at the time that they were developed. In particular, this statement refers to precise location information of spring orifices from the pre-development period. And in testimony offered by Mr. Eggers or others in this and others in this proceeding, none of the parties have produced survey coordinates or other precise location information that will tell us exactly where spring orifices were located relative to the water collection infrastructure. This is relevant because certain statements made by the prosecution team rely on the proximity of spring orifices to the creek channel or tributary channels, and frankly, information regarding the precise location of those spring orifices doesn't exist. The next topic I'd like to discuss is Mr. Eggers' characterization of shut-in testing at boreholes 10, 11, and 12. He asserts that the results of shut-in testing at boreholes 10, 11, 12 conducted in 2021 are unreliable because compared to the 2017 shut-in testing conducted at those same boreholes have different metrics and different objectives and testing criteria applied for those two separate tests. It's important to understand that the 2017 and 2021 shut-in tests at these boreholes were conducted to satisfy different testing criteria. And in particular, the 2017 testing was conducted to understand the changes in the upgradient edge of the spring area. So effectively the inches of wetted soil adjacent to the spring area. Whereas the 2021 shut-in test was conducted specifically to address criteria set forth by the Forest Service. And those criteria were to understand the relationship between borehole water collection and flow in the channel of Strawberry Creek. In both of these tests were conducted with appropriate metrics, with appropriate analyses, and both test results are valid. But it is important to understand that the tests were conducted for different purposes and to examine different aspects of the spring area at 10, 11, 12. The last topic I'd like to address with regards to Mr. Eggers' testimony is the fact that he relies on two statements made by Mr. Rowe in the 1930s, or I should say in 1930, to support his opinion that Tunnel 2 was constructed as a trench or a ditch type feature that was later covered with a concrete structure and then backfilled. There's only two references in Mr. Rowe's notes that Mr. Eggers relies on to come to this conclusion. And frankly, those references are at odds with the fact that Mr. Rowe does refer to this excavation and the feature at Tunnel 2 as a tunnel. He doesn't refer to it as a trench or a ditch anywhere in his notes that I've been able to find, and no place that Mr. Eggers has cited. A more plausible description of what Mr. Rowe meant in his notes is depicted in a proposed exhibit BTB, I believe, 44. And if we could bring that on the screen, I would appreciate it.
Yes, Ms. Mullen, please display exhibit BTB 44.
And while she's bringing that up, I'll describe what this is that we're going to look at here in a minute. This is a photograph of a mine portal that was constructed in the 1940s. The mine is referred to as the Mather Mine. This photograph shows typical construction of tunnels or a mine portal during that period of time and displays methods of construction that might have been similar to those used at Tunnel 2. In particular, what we see here is that the hillside has been cut back to create a working face for the tunnelers to proceed in a safe manner as they move underground. There's also a concrete structure that was constructed at the face to prevent or to allow safe access and to prevent sloughing and parts of the hillside coming down on the tunnel entrance. It's my opinion that Tunnel 2 was constructed in a manner similar to that shown in this photo. And I do have experience working in tunnels and underground mine applications throughout my career. And so from this perspective, I believe that Mr. Eggers' opinion that Tunnel 2 was constructed as a trench is not correct. And that concludes my testimony with regards to Mr. Eggers.
Okay, so Ms. Mullen, you may take down Exhibit BTB 44 and please proceed. I think you're now going to summarize your rebuttal to Mr. Lowe's testimony.
Correct. Mr. Lowe states that I was incorrect when I indicated that hydrologic conditions in Strawberry Canyon are similar in part to those observed by Rowe. In particular, this statement refers to the fact that Strawberry Creek is currently characterized as an intermittent stream, and it had characteristics of an intermittent stream at the time that Mr. Rowe did his work in the canyon as well. And in particular, we conducted a 59-month study of flow in Strawberry Creek, and flow values measured by Mr. Rowe in his 9-month study fall within the range of values that we measured in Strawberry Canyon at specific locations. And so while there may have been changes in the canyon since Mr. Rowe did his work, certainly the classification of Strawberry Creek as intermittent remains unchanged from that time. Mr. Lowe also asserts that conclusions that I make with regards to flow in Strawberry Creek relative to shut-in tests are unsupported. It's important to understand that shut-in tests conducted at boreholes 1, 1A, and 8, 10, 11, and 12 were conducted to measure the influence of water collection at those locations on the nearest existing surface water bodies. Certainly the results of that testing is described in BTB 7. And what those tests show is that shut-in and turnout of those boreholes did not have a measurable effect on surface water expression at Spring 4 or in Strawberry Creek relative to boreholes 10, 11, and 12. Mr. Lowe asserts that my statement that tunnels 2 and 3 and the 7's boreholes don't have effect on surface flow in Strawberry Creek follows from the fact that those tunnels and boreholes are located further from the existing surface water expressions than the boreholes that were actually tested for relationship to those surface water expressions. And given that they're further from the creek, the likelihood of those having an effect greater than the boreholes that were near the creek is unlikely. And that concludes my testimony with regards to Mr. Lowe's testimony. And if I understood, you would like me to follow with Mr. rebuttal to Mr. Allard?
No, please, excuse me. It's going to be best, particularly for my simple mind, to follow this if Mr. Allard provides the summary of his testimony, and then you summarize your rebuttal to his testimony. So we'll come back to you for that. That's going to be round 3 of our hearings this morning, but you're done with, I assume you're done with your summary of BTB 42, so that will complete your summary for round 1, and we'll proceed to cross-examination. Did you have anything else you wanted to say in your summary for BTB 42? All right.
No, that concludes my summary.
All right, so does anybody want to ask Mr. Nichols cross-examination questions? And at this point, they definitely are limited to his testimony in Exhibit BTB 42. So I see Mr. Petrozelli's hand is up. I see Mr. Bielecki's hand is up. I don't see any other hands. Oh, Ms. Fry. Ms. Fry, your electronic hand is up. Good. All right, does anybody else want to ask cross-examination questions of Mr. Nichols? All right, so Mr. Petrozelli, you may take down your electronic hand and begin your cross-examination. I'm going to allow 15 minutes. If you need more, you can provide an offer of proof, but this is pretty limited testimony, so I'm thinking that 15 minutes will be sufficient. So please go ahead and get started, and we'll see where we are after 15 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Can we put Mr. Nichols' testimony? Oh, Mr. Lilly, the first thing I wanted to ask, this doesn't relate to Mr. Nichols' testimony. I don't see Mr. Grunwald. I did not see him in the Zoom tiles. So is he testifying today?
We'll get to him.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, I probably misspoke. We'll do 4 rounds since his testimony is completely separate from Mr. Nichols, and frankly, very short. Let's just go ahead and do cross-ex of Mr. Nichols first, and then we'll see where we are with Mr. Grunwald.
Okay, because
I don't see his tile here either, but let's get to that after we're done with cross-ex of Mr. Nichols.
Okay, so can we put Mr. Nichols' testimony on screen, please?
Yeah, Ms. Mullins, please display exhibit BTB 42. All right, tell us where you want us to scroll to, Mr. Petrozelli.
So if we can go down to paragraph 4, and actually we can skip past this.
Yeah, 4 was not admitted into evidence, so I'm not going to allow questions about 4.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Nichols, I wanted to ask you about your testimony about the lack of survey data for the pre-development springs. So if we can go to page 2 and paragraph 5, within this paragraph, you state that you are not aware of survey coordinates or other precise data indicating where natural spring orifices were located in the pre-development period relative to the developed infrastructure. Is that correct?
Yes.
And on page 13, in paragraph 43, starting on line 25, we can.
Okay, let us get there. Go to page 13, paragraph 43, line 25. And Ms. Mullen, if you can make it 1 notch bigger, please. Thank you. All right, go ahead. Now, if you can ask your question, Mr. Petrozelli.
I believe you have, and it continues on to the next page, but I believe you have a substantially similar statement indicating that you lack pre-development survey data for the springs. Is that a fair characterization?
It is. Mr. Lowe made a similar assertion. Yes.
Okay. So, and I wanted to clarify what you mean by this. Are you saying that this lack of survey coordinates or other type of precise data, as I believe you characterize it, are you saying you don't know where the springs prior to their development were located at all?
I don't know the location of the spring orifices in the pre-development period. We obviously have narrative records from Mr. Rowe that says spring orifices existed, but I could not with any certainty identify the location of those orifices based on available data.
I'd like to examine that a little. I'd like to examine that a little more. Can we look at BTB4, please?
All right, let's display exhibit BTB4.
And I think Mr. Nichols' screen, his image is frozen. I'm not sure if he's
Uh-oh,
with us.
I'm still here. Can you hear me?
we can hear you. Wait, wave your hand. Let's see if we can. I think your video may have frozen, but we can
Right.
hear your audio. So we'll go ahead and display. Uh-oh. Oh, there you are. You're back.
Better?
Good.
Yeah.
Good. We don't want to lose you. Not right now. All right. We have exhibit BTB4 on the screen. Mr. Petrozelli, tell us what page you would like us to scroll.
All right, and briefly, this looks like a letter from McGuire, Pearson, Story, who are attorneys for the respondent. This is dated April 10, 2018. I think if we scroll down a little further, subject line, Nestle NWNA's third response to State Water Board report of investigation. If we go down to page 2.
All right, let's go to page 2. Let us get there before you there. Go ahead. Now you can ask your question.
If we go down a little farther, signed by Rita McGuire for attorney for the respondent. And then if we go down to page 3. So this page, it appears, begins a technical memorandum dated April 10, 2018. Mr. Nichols, did you author this memorandum?
I did.
Okay. Do you recall this memorandum?
I certainly recall it. I haven't memorized it line by line, but yes.
Okay. Can we go down to the bottom of this page, please? Okay. So starting on this last line where it says each of the tunnels, Mr. Nichols, can you read that sentence and then it continues on to the next page? So we just need that sentence.
Each of the tunnels and horizontal boreholes were
Okay, there we go.
constructed at or adjacent to naturally occurring spring sites for the purpose of capturing spring water and developing additional water from the same underground strata feeding the springs.
So, Mr. Nichols, describing the tunnels and boreholes in this manner, as having been constructed at or adjacent to naturally occurring spring sites, does that indicate, I mean, did you have at least some knowledge of where the spring sites were located prior to their development in order to make that statement?
I didn't have any more knowledge than I've testified to, and that statement really is reflective of what I would consider oral history, what we're told from some of the earlier reports that have been admitted into evidence.
Did you consider that oral history adequate to, well, strike that. Do you believe this was an informed statement?
With regards to the level of detail it presents, yes.
Okay, thank you. Do you believe the, I think what you characterized as an oral history, do you believe that was adequate to make this informed statement?
To the extent.
Objection, vague.
Overruled. Go ahead, you may answer.
To the extent that that was the only information that we have or had, yes, that would be considered informed.
And then if we can go back to BTB 42.
Right, Ms. Mullen, please display exhibit BTB 42. Tell us what, Mr. Petroselli, tell us what page.
On page 2, please.
All right, we'll go back to page 2.
I wanted to start from line 15 to the end. Can you read those? The
Why don't
last
you
two
make,
sentences?
Ms. Mullen, please make it one notch bigger, one increment bigger. And yeah, and then scroll down just a couple of lines. There we go. Go ahead. Thank you.
Mr. Nichols, can you read those last 2 sentences in that paragraph for us?
Without these data, it is not possible to know exactly how close spring orifices may have been to the boreholes and tunnels, or the topographic relationship between the spring orifices and the developed infrastructure. Consequently, analysis of the relationship between the orifices and topographic channels in the pre-development period is speculative.
And we may need you to slow down a little bit. So if the lack of survey coordinates makes analyzing the relationship between spring orifices and topographic channels in the pre-development period speculative, does that, in your opinion, and based on your professional experience, completely preclude your ability to determine the relative percentages of groundwater and surface water discharged from each tunnel or borehole?
I would say that relationship is not a deciding factor on the percentage of groundwater and surface water discharged from each of the collection points.
Okay. So could you analyze that percentage without the precise survey coordinates?
I would say that analysis is not dependent on the precise survey coordinates.
Okay.
And I would like to object because I think we've got some confused terms, and I apologize for not saying it just a moment ago. Mr. Petroselli is using the terms groundwater and surface water, and it's not clear how he's framing these questions.
Okay, the objection is overruled. Mr. Nichols seemed to understand the terms, so I think the question was clear to him and his answer was clear to me. So, Mr. Petroselli, you may proceed.
So, Mr. Nichols, is it possible to determine the relative percentages of groundwater and surface water discharged from each tunnel?
Objection. Objection. I think in this hearing, we've been using words like developed water or naturally surfacing water. And I think Mr. Petroselli is confusing some terms and is making this record imprecise.
So, Mr. Petroselli, I actually have a different problem. I don't think this is within the scope of this testimony in exhibit BTB. Wait. Let me finish, please. In BTB 42, he's just said that the relative locations of the historical spring and the current infrastructure is not relevant or is not a determining factor. I wrote down determining factor in determining the percentage of groundwater and surface water. So I don't think there's anything in his testimony that does, in fact, discuss percentages of groundwater and surface water.
Okay. Well, he said it's not dependent on knowing that data. So I'm trying to understand what that would mean.
Yeah. Well, and you're getting into a topic he did not cover.
Okay.
His testimony.
All right.
So I think you need to move on.
Okay. So if we can go down to page 3, and I'd like in paragraph 9.
Right.
So, Mr. Nichols, here in paragraph 9, you state that 3 wetted areas appeared in an otherwise dry western channel during the shut-in tests. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and that was during the shut-ins. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And although, as you say, the puddles in this western channel did not connect to surface flow in Strawberry Creek, they were still in a channel. Is that correct?
Yes, it was a small channel. It wasn't. I don't have another way to describe it, but yes, it was a
Okay.
small depression. Yeah.
All right. And then if we go to the bottom of page 3 in paragraph 10, and this continues on to the next page. You state that you did not try to correlate the changes in flow in what I
think
believe.
excuse me, Mr. Petrozelli, Ms. Mullen, please go to page 4. I think your question is the top sentence here.
Okay.
Go ahead with the question.
And I believe you did not attempt to correlate the changes in flow in what BTB7 described as a rivulet with the total discharge from the entire spring discharge area, because the changes were less than the range of error of measurements for that whole spring discharge area. Is that a fair characterization?
Yes.
Okay. And when you say the entire spring discharge area, is that the entire lower spring complex?
Yes.
Okay. So you were comparing the range of error for the entire lower spring complex with the change in discharge from that one rivulet. Is that correct?
I have to think about how you phrase that question a bit. In effect, obviously BTB7 describes very small changes in flow in that rivulet. We looked at a single rivulet, and there are many of them around that area. And so the change in flow that we detected would not have been measurable in Strawberry Creek, in the main channel of Strawberry Creek, just given the magnitude of flows there.
Right, but that was based on your assessment of the flows from this one rivulet relative to the entire lower spring complex. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Since we're talking about this single rivulet compared to the entire lower spring complex, in your opinion, based on your professional expertise and opinion and experience, if you put a small enough pump in a large enough stream, is it possible that you could pump a measurable but still small enough amount of water for that pumping rate to be less than the range of error of flow measurement for the stream?
Objection, outside the scope.
Overruled. This is a hypothetical question that is related to these shut-in tests.
If I understand your question, I'd like to restate it if I could, just to make sure I understand it.
Just go ahead and state your answer as best you can. That's probably the best way to go forward.
Sure. So if I understand the question, you're asking if a small pump could possibly pump from the creek a quantity of water that might not be detectable given the measurement method.
So
yes.
in this hypothetical, we're talking about a small pump and a large stream.
Yes.
Yeah.
The answer is yes.
Okay. And then, Mr. Nichols, I'd like to ask you about the 2021 shut-in tests.
And then, go ahead and do that, Mr. Petrozelli, and then I'm going to ask you for an offer of proof regarding what other matters you want to cover. But go ahead and ask him about the 2021.
Okay. I only have perhaps one or two other sets of questions.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. If we can go to page 4 and about halfway down in paragraph 13.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Mullen. If you can scroll down to paragraph 13, we have it there. Go, just go down a little, go down so we can see that that's there, right there. Perfect,
Okay.
thank you.
So in this paragraph, Mr. Nichols, you describe the goals for the 2021 shut-in tests, and I'm being general, as determining the sensitivity of flow in Strawberry Creek at a specific location to water collection at boreholes 10, 11, and 12. Is that generally a fair characterization?
Yes.
Okay. And you were comparing the collection at the boreholes to a location about a mile downstream. Is that correct?
That's the location where the flow criterion was established.
Okay.
But during the test, we monitored flow at 5 or 6 locations between that point and the water collection location.
Okay. Did the Forest Service select that location?
The 0.1 mile downstream, yes.
Okay. So this 2021 shut-in test, it was designed to evaluate the flow response at this specific location in Strawberry Creek, rather than a flow response at any location in Strawberry Creek. Is that fair?
I think to correctly state that, there was a specific location about a mile down gradient that the Forest Service had established a flow criteria. And we monitored flow at that location, and also up adjacent to the spring area at 10, 11, 12. So you've seen references to cross section 49, which is right at the base of the spring area. And that was the primary location of our data collection, because we anticipated that to be most sensitive to changes at the borehole.
Okay. And then I wanted to ask you, last question, page 12. If we can go down to page 12.
All right, Ms. Mullen, please scroll to page 12. Thank you. Mr. Petrozelli, tell us what paragraph you would like us to scroll to. Paragraph
36.
All right, we have it.
Okay, starting line 4. Mr. Nichols, the mine tunnel depicted in BTB 44 that you describe here in this paragraph, do you know how long that mine tunnel was?
I don't recall exactly, but it was a very extensive mine.
So it was, forgive me for being imprecise, a long tunnel.
Yes.
Okay. And those are my questions, Mr. Oh, I'm sorry. Would you say it was longer than 30 feet?
Yes.
Okay. And those are my questions, Mr. Lilly.
All right, thank you, Mr. Petrozelli. So with that, Ms. Fry, you had raised your hand. You may proceed with your questions for Mr. Nichols, and I'll allow you 15 minutes.
I want to go to paragraph 8 in your testimony.
All right, so Ms. Mullen, please, let me see what page that is on here. Please display page 3 of exhibit BTB 42 and scroll to paragraph 8. Excellent, thank you. Go ahead, Ms. Fry.
You state that the purpose of the shut-in test for 10, 11, 12 was to meet the definition of food product for spring water, correct? Stated in this?
Objection, Ms. Steets.
I'm going to overrule the objection. I think that paraphrases pretty accurately what's in line 7 and 8. Mr. Nichols, you may go ahead and answer.
Effectively, yes.
Okay. And you use Dames and Moore's study that's referenced in BT 7, page 740.
I don't understand the context of the question. I use Dames and Moore for what purpose are you asking?
To identify the spring locations.
I didn't use that report to identify spring locations.
Okay. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Fry. So I think, Mr. Bilecki, you had said you wanted to ask questions. You may proceed. I'll allow 15 minutes for your cross-examination questions.
Thank you. Could we see BTB 44, please?
Okay, we'll put up BTB 44. Ms. Mullen will put up exhibit BTB 44. And she'll make it big. There, go ahead. You may ask your question.
Thank you. So, Mr. Nichols, in viewing this photograph, you commented that this is typical, or this is of tunnel development. Do you have specific references to vehicles being used in this manner in Tunnel 2 or Tunnel 3 construction?
I don't have specific references to vehicles at Tunnel 2 and Tunnel 3, but the pathway that we take down to Tunnel 2 location was at one point able to support some degree of vehicle traffic.
And during the site visit, we visited Tunnel 3, and from my recollection, that's a much steeper slope compared to Tunnel 2, for example. And why do you think that this type of construction would be applicable to Tunnel 3 development?
I would say the construction method is irrespective of the presence of a truck there. Certainly, we know that they had some type of excavation at Tunnel 2. And we do know that concrete was mixed and used there because we can see evidence of that. How specifically they got those materials down there, I don't know personally. I can tell you within the time frame that I've worked up there, you used to be able to get down to Tunnel 2 with a side-by-side or a quad using the old 1930s road.
The roadway that, if you want to call it a roadway, the pathway that we walked on during the site visit to Tunnel 2 is constricted in nature. I'm let me start over again.
Yeah, try to turn it into a question, please.
Yes. Do you feel that an open tunnel construction, as described by Mr. Eggers, is more likely than a much more vehicle-intensive construction as shown in this photograph?
The construction method hypothesized by Mr. Eggers would be more intensive for the use of equipment, because as we go back in Tunnel 2, the tunnel becomes deeper under the mountain. And so that would be an excavation that would be 25 feet deep and 30 feet long, whereas you remove a much smaller quantity of material, of rock, to just bore a hole, to bore a tunnel into the hillside. And that's typically why tunneling is done that way.
Does this photograph appear to be on relatively level ground
No,
where the vehicle is located, given the context of this photograph? Does that appear to be on a developed roadway?
it appears that it's on a, what I would consider a cut road, right? Somebody cut a road in the earth there.
And is there evidence at the time that the Tunnel 2 and Tunnel 3 were developed of this level of roadway development?
I don't know what the road looked like at that period of time. The one thing that I can relate from personal experience is after the fires in 2004, the road was cleared and I was able to drive from Highway 18 down to Tunnel 2 in a side-by-side off-road vehicle. And in the past, I know that we were able to get down as far as Tunnel 3 or the hillside just above Tunnel 3.
And does the use of a described side-by-side type of vehicle access allow for the type of construction materials as shown in this photograph?
Well, we know that they got concrete down to the Tunnel 2 and Tunnel 3 location. Whether they used mules and wagons or some type of motorized equipment, we don't know, but we know they got the materials down there.
Okay, thank you.
Are those all your
That's all.
questions? All right.
Yes.
All right. Does anybody else want, you may take down that exhibit, Ms. Mullen. Thank you. Those were all the hands I saw. Does anyone else have any cross-examination questions for Mr. Nichols regarding exhibit BTB 42? All right. I don't see any other hands. I don't have any other questions. So, Ms. Grady, do you have any redirect questions for Mr. Nichols?
I do not.
All right. Would you like to offer these exhibits into evidence?
Yes, I apologize. I don't have the list up in front of me. I've got to switch screens. Do you have the numbers?
Oh, hell, it's short.
Thank you.
Would you like to offer exhibit BTB 42 and exhibit BTB 44 into evidence?
I would, yes, please.
And I've previously ruled I'm not going to accept BTB 43.
We would like to reserve our right on 43 to readdress the judicial notice issue that you referenced. Or
Yeah, and just
for purposes of briefing.
Okay, and just to clarify, when you ask for notice before the State Water Board, it's official notice. We're not a court, so you can't ask for judicial notice, but you may ask for that. And of course, other parties may object, and then if necessary, and then I'll make a ruling. All right, so with that, are there any objections to exhibits BTB 42 and 44 coming into evidence being received? All right, seeing none, exhibits BTB 42 and 44 will be received into evidence. In just a minute, let me turn off my phone. Excuse me. And with that, the next stage for this morning is we have a declaration from Ross Grunwald, which is exhibit BTB 45. I don't see Mr. Grunwald displayed here. Ms. Grady or Mr. Sanders, how do you want to proceed with this declaration?
Mr. Grunwald is available if you need him. He is, as we've discussed with some other parties here, an independent party. He was not really retained in relation to this litigation, but has graciously made himself available if you need him to be available if anybody has cross-examination questions or if you want him to further confirm his sworn statement.
All right, so just a minute here, there we go. So I've read his declaration, which basically just authenticates exhibit BTB 40. I am willing to accept this declaration into evidence without having him testify live for the limited purpose of authenticating this exhibit, and specifically he separately authenticates figures 7 and 9 in the exhibit. Does anybody have any objections to that? If anybody does, then I will ask Ms. Grady to arrange for Mr. Grunwald to appear. Mr. Petroselli, your hand is up. Go ahead.
So, I mean, one, this declaration is hearsay. I also question its relevance. BTB 40 was offered solely for the purpose of impeachment of testimony offered by Mr. Eggers regarding State Water Board Order 2019-0149. However, this declaration does not indicate that BTB 40 was a part of the record in that hearing or otherwise involved in testimony in that hearing. So I don't believe it demonstrates relevance towards the purpose that BTB 40 was offered previously.
All
May I
right.
respond?
No, you don't need to. Not yet, anyway. Does anybody else have any comments? So Mr. Petroselli, I'm going to overrule the objection on everything except hearsay. The hearsay objection is valid. This declaration is hearsay. And I think Ms. Grady has acknowledged that. As far as offering BTB 45, it's offered for the purposes of authenticating BTB 40. And yes, they offered BTB 40 originally as part of their impeachment questions for Mr. Eggers, but I take it as them offering that now as rebuttal. And you did offer through Mr. Eggers some applications from that proceeding, which talked about estimated or projected or, I don't know, planned borehole depths of up to 300 feet. And I think it's perfectly appropriate for them to rebut that to show that the final construction was a much lower number, I'll just say. So with that, do you want to stand by your objection on hearsay grounds? Because if you do,
Yes.
all right,
So,
then
and I think it's, and I think there's a distinction that that I think is getting lost. Mr. Eggers was testifying as to what the board orders had said and what the board had determined. So if BTB 40 was not in the record for the hearing for 2019-0149, it is not relevant to the board's assessment of its permitting authority in that order.
All right, I'm going to overrule that. I heard that objection before and I understood it, and I'm overruling. I think that goes to the weight of the evidence, not its admissibility. I mean, it certainly is all part of the general circumstances regarding those two springs. So, but as I said, there is a hearsay objection. And Ms. Grady, I think you said you could make arrangements to have Mr. Grunwald available. Is that correct?
Yes, and to clarify, he's offered this as written sworn testimony, and he is available to join us via Zoom to confirm his testimony.
Yes. Well, there are two purposes. Number one, for him to confirm it, so it's not hearsay, so it's actual testimony in the hearing. And then obviously number two, to make him available for cross-examination. Of course, limited to the scope of his testimony. But I do think, based on the fact that I'm allowing BTB 40 as effective rebuttal, that the questions, at least some questions, I hope this doesn't get out of hand, but at least some questions regarding that would be appropriate if Mr. Petroselli wants to ask them. So what time is he available? Is he available right now? If we take a short break, can you get him? That would be the best.
I believe he is. Let me double check with my colleagues. I think
Okay.
Mr. Sanders had been in contact with him.
Mr. Sanders, do you have the latest? You have to go off. There we go.
I do not know the availability of him. I know that our client has been having correspondence with him, and I think that my understanding is that he is available. I just haven't had the direct contact with him.
I
All right,
apologize
let's do
for
this.
misrepresenting Mr. Stander's involvement.
But I do believe he is available.
All right, let's do this. We'll take a break. We normally don't take 2 breaks in the morning, but we can. Let's take a 10-minute break and see if you can find him and get him logged into Zoom. I'm hoping this will not take very long for him. So hopefully it won't take up much of his time or ours. But I'd like to do it now. This is the logical point before we proceed with the next round of our testimony, which will be Mr. Aller. So it's 10:16 on my clock, 10:06 right now on my clock. So let's take a break till 10:16. Mr. Sanders, see if you can locate him and get him to log on. And just as a reminder to everybody, please do not log off, but you may and probably should turn your cameras and microphones off, and we'll be back at 10:16.
All right, thank you.
You.
right, we'll wait just one moment for Mr. Petrozelli and we'll get started. All right, Mr. Sanders, were you able to make contact with Mr. Grunwald?
Mr. Lilly, I actually spoke with him and
Okay.
he's trying to dial in. Unfortunately, I had a little miscommunication as to his status. He had suffered an injury and I thought he was convalescing at home in front of a computer. He's actually at an urgent care facility, waiting his turn to be seen, but is trying to call in. But because of the location, it's not supporting video he can't support video on his phone, either location or his phone, but he's trying to dial into the phone number for the Zoom meeting at the moment.
Okay,
Alternatively, he could be available he thinks he'll be back in the office by this afternoon. It was just an unavoidable incident.
yeah. You know, I'm not a tyrant here. I think some of you may think so, but I certainly would like to respect if he's in an urgent care facility. Number one, I want to respect that. That's obviously important for him. Number two, it's going to be hard for him to multitask and focus on that and on this testimony. And obviously, if he's testifying here, I want him to be able to focus on it. So it sounds like we should schedule him for some time this afternoon. I have to take a break from 2 to 2:30. Do you think it would work well to schedule him for 2:30?
We can try that. He just sent me a note that he was they just called him to go in. So
Okay.
he's now no longer available at the moment.
Yeah, and that's fine. Let's do this. But you're obviously in phone contact with him. Let's proceed with the other parts of our testimony and see where we are. And then we'll give him a time to report in. I mean, I don't want to interrupt with his urgent care. I don't know what it is, but it sounds urgent. So let's proceed with the others, and we will circle back to Mr. Grunwald. And if I ever conveyed anything to the contrary, I certainly did not intend to. I will be flexible. So
Thank you.
with that, let's proceed with Mr. Allard. So Ms. Doty, where are you? There you are. Sorry, every time somebody logs on, the tiles move around on my screen. So anyway, I see you now. So Ms. Doty, we've received exhibits SOS 288 through 301. So I'm going to get ready here. And in particular, exhibit SOS 288 is labeled Sir Rebuttal Testimony of Gregory Allard. I see Mr. Allard, there you are. And now, Ms. Grady, your hand is up. Go ahead.
Yes, I had some objections to certain statements in the written testimony and to the slideshow, which Mr. Allard is supposed to be using to support his summary of testimony, but on its face goes beyond the written testimony and appears to be an expansion and exceeding the limited purpose and the limited page number provided.
Okay, so what are your objections to his written testimony? That's SOS. Thanks. And Ms. Doty, we will get to Mr. Allard. Mr. Allard, please be patient. We might as well do this. We might as well do this first. So what are your objections to SOS Exhibit 288?
288, starting on page 2, paragraph 3, Mr. Allard uses quotation marks that misstate the testimony.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to catch up.
Okay. We'll go one at a time. I sure think that goes to the weight and not the admissibility of the testimony. Ms. Doty, do you have a comment on or response to the objection?
Not if you're going to overrule it.
All right, let's just say I will overrule that. I think, Ms. Grady, if you think Mr. Allard has misquoted Mr. Nichols' testimony, you certainly point that out either on cross-examination or in your brief, but that goes to the weight, not to the admissibility. Go ahead with your objections.
Paragraph 4, the language on 21, lines 21 and 22 is speculation regarding actions well before I think our witness was alive.
May I respond to that?
You don't need to. That objection is overruled. He's clearly established he has sufficient knowledge of the history of how the USGS used to do. I'll just say used to do things and their practices in 1901. So if your objection was the lack of foundation, I think there is adequate foundation for him to testify to that. Go ahead with your other objections.
Paragraph 7, similarly, speculation and lack of foundation, in that he states one document, quote, clearly showing field crews were on site and mapped physical features based upon direct observation, referring to a different document.
Okay, and that objection also is overruled. That goes to the weight, not the admissibility.
Okay, and then the paragraph, I apologize, I don't have my glasses.
Welcome to the club.
I know. And I left them downstairs, so I don't want to put you on hold. Let me see if I can pull up another document to make this easier. The reference to SOS 298, which is hearsay. This is
wait. What paragraph in his testimony are you at? Sorry. Oh, is that I see 298?
Holding it farther away from my face. He testifies regarding SOS 298 in the body of the document.
I see that in paragraph 10 at the bottom, starting at the bottom of page 4, there's a reference to SOS 298.
Thank you. And his testimony is essentially that here's an email sent to Ms. Doty and is being offered for the truth of the matter asserted in the email written by a non-party and then sent via email to Ms. Doty, who, and then Mr. Allard is quoting it and citing it. And so we object to the testimony and to the document itself.
Ms. Doty, do you want to respond to that objection?
Well, so I would say that hearsay isn't strictly applied in a water board hearing, as we've been through a few different times, and that action was done at Mr. Allard's direction. He directed one of my staff members to contact, which she did, and then forwarded the email to Mr. Allard.
Okay, I interpret the objection to go to the fact that there's no authentication of this historical geologic survey document, and I overrule that objection. First of all, I don't think there's much question about the authenticity, and certainly Mr. Allard has sufficient expertise to recognize a historical geologic survey document when he sees one, regardless of how he ended up obtaining it.
Mr. Lilly, that's not my objection.
All right, go ahead. Maybe I didn't understand. I mean, I thought your objection was that Ms. Doty's email basically authenticated the document, but if I'm missing something, go ahead and tell me your objection.
No, the email is just the opinions and thoughts of the writer, which is being offered as evidence and quoted.
Where do you see? I don't see anything from Ms. Doty's. Maybe I'm not reading in the same place you are in the testimony.
The email is identified as SOS 298, and it's an email correspondence from Jennifer Runyon, who SOS has identified as a research staff person. And it is Ms. Runyon's analysis and opinion about historical information that she has dug up, and it is being offered and quoted by Mr. Allard and offered for the truth of the matter asserted in the body of the email.
Okay.
Ms. Runyon's thoughts.
And
Okay,
Mr. Lilly,
now I see what you're saying. I'm sorry if I didn't understand your objection before.
and this falls into the situation where this is corroborated by other evidence. So it's not a hearsay statement that's offered independently as the only evidence of a particular fact. So we would ask that it just be considered in hearsay objections that we're doing in bulk in later proceeding.
Okay, I don't think there's any question about the authenticity of this, and I'm not hearing, Ms. Grady has explained that I did not understand that correctly, and she's not objecting to authenticity, she's objecting on hearsay grounds. So I will accept Ms. Stodd's, I'll say, offer that this be treated as hearsay and admitted subject to the limitations on admissibility of hearsay evidence in Government Code Section 11513 subdivision D, which I believe takes care of the objection and the response. So with that, we may. Do you have any other objections, Ms. Grady?
Then my only other objection, as I stated at the outset, was Mr. Allard's slideshow on its face goes beyond the scope of his testimony, and instead of being a summary, appears to expand on the testimony. And I can note line by slide by slide where the cited information exceeds anything in the body of his written testimony.
You might want to tell me where you think there are problems with that. Certainly a lot of it is quoting prior exhibits, but tell me where you think that your objection applies, which slides it applies to. I have SOS 295 in front of me.
Yes, so to be clear, he has made statements in his written testimony and then identified a document as a citation. And then in the slides, kind of dives deeper apparently into the cited exhibit, blowing up certain pages, highlighting language. In other words, expanding very clearly on the scope of what's in the written testimony. So it appears this may have been an end run around the 5-page limitation on the written testimony, but on its face. And I can go slide by slide, starting with slide number 5.
Yeah, you don't need to go slide by slide. I'm going to overrule that objection. I'm going to exercise my discretion as the hearing officer to allow that testimony. I did set a page limit, and I did specify written testimony and summary, but I mean, at that time, I had no idea what the content of the testimony was going to be. And I'm going to give Mr. Allard some leeway to provide the testimony the way he did. I think he's entitled to that particularly as a qualified expert witness. I think he has some leeway in the method of presentation of his testimony. So those objections to SOS 295 are overruled. So with that, let's go ahead. Were there any other objections before we got started with his testimony, Ms. Brady? All right.
Nothing further, Mr. Lilly.
All right. So Mr. Allard, good morning. Please raise your right hand, your real one, not your electronic one. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you will be giving in this proceeding will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
And is exhibit SOS 288, in fact, your testimony for this hearing?
It is.
You're on. Oh, Mr. Lilly, can we have him state and spell his full name?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Dice. Mr. Allard, for the court reporter's benefit, please state and spell your first and last name.
Okay, Gregory, Gregory, Allard, Allord.
And I'm going to give you a warning up front. You may or may not need it, but we tell all the witnesses this. Turn down your pace of delivery to about 80% of what you think is right, because the court reporter has to get down every word. And in my experience, almost every witness, when they start testifying, goes fast, and it's just really hard for the court reporter to get it all down. And of course, we want to have a completely accurate transcript. So with that, Ms. Doty, oh, wait, I forgot if I asked before, but is Exhibit SOS 288 your testimony for this hearing?
It is.
All right, so Ms. Doty, you may proceed with your questions for Mr. Allard. I'm going to allow you 15 minutes. If we get to the end of 15 and you think we need more, let me know. I have read both Mr. Allard's written testimony, SOS 288, and his slides 295. So he certainly doesn't need to cover everything, but you can ask him to summarize the key points. So with that, 1032, you may proceed.
If we could pull up SOS 295, please.
All right, Ms. Mullen, please display SOS 295.
And then I believe I'll let Mr. Allard summarize his testimony, directing advancement of the slides.
And so, Mr. Allard, if you just say next slide, Ms. Mullen will go to the next slides as you ask
Okay,
her.
slide 2, please. Next slide. Okay, thank you. Most of my career was spent as a cartographer, working with scientists, geologists, hydrologists, to help them.
Sorry, I didn't hear the name that you started out with. You said somebody is a cartologist?
Cartographer, I think. Mr. Allard, try again, a little more slowly with more enunciation.
Okay. Most of my career was spent as a cartographer, working with scientists, geologists, hydrologists, other engineers to help them map, analyze, and publish their reports. I'd like to take a moment to say that I'm testifying today as a professional cartographer. I am not representing any government agency or bureau. I'm retired and have been for some time. Next slide, please. Okay. Certain elements that I want to touch on today that Mr. Nichols had brought up, that he was talking about the mapping objectives of the 1905 map, the mapping practices. He touched on the technology and georeferencing processes and apparent misalignment of streams on the exhibit BTB 38 in the 1905 map. Next slide, please. Actually, 2 more. Go to slide 5. Okay, yes. This map is setting the background of what is there, the purpose of the topographic maps of the era that we're talking to. These quotes that are here emphasize the importance of topographic maps as base maps for properly conducted geologic studies. That was woven into the fabric of the U.S. Geological Survey from the very first years and continues to this day. So these quotes reinforce that topographic mapping was very critical and a major portion of the Geological Survey's work. And John Leslie Powell, the second director of the USGS, emphasized that in many different ways and also internationally, because it was fairly unique in Earth science organizations that topographic mapping was done in the same agency as geologic mapping and to support those geologic maps. The next slide, please.
And just for the record, we're on slide 6 now of exhibit SOS 295.
The topographic maps that were done had some very primary focuses that were critical and inherent into those maps. And that was to record the natural features that were on the land surface. That included streams, bodies of water, valleys, hills, mountains, and limited cultural features. Okay, and as noted in some of the exhibits that were submitted, they were all to be done and represented with mathematical accuracy. Go to slide 8 for mapping practices and inherent into the process. This is a representation that to achieve this mathematical accuracy, advancements were made very consistently and steadily throughout the years. And They documented their processes, published them, gave them to field crews, and also were very actively involved in improving the technologies, the equipment of the era. The next slide.
Okay, and just so for the record, we're on Exhibit SOS 295, slide 9.
This is some of the equipment that was either invented by and improved by USGS scientists, or in the case of the one on the right in figure 18 there, it was adapted by a commercial firm and incorporated into their commercial surveying instruments. So that was necessary for the highly accurate surveys that were conducted. Slide 10, please. While the field crews were there, one of the last steps that they did was what they called at the time sketching. And sketching then was a term used for the capturing of the cartographic representation of these natural features. There was a chief of the party, as documented, and it was his responsibility for doing this sketching, the cartographic rendering. So they were there, they were on the ground, and part of their standing operating procedures, as documented, was to be visually recording what they're looking at the time. Slide 11, please. The topographic maps that I'll be talking about were made in the preceding years to the 1905 hydrologic map that has been discussed in the past, especially plate 12. Okay, the maps that were done were at a scale of approximately 1 inch to a mile, 1 to 62,500. The field crews were organized. They went out and did horizontal control, where that control was in place, and it called for all the streams and important topographic features to be sketched, and vertical control was also required. 13.
Okay, we're now moving to slide 13 of Exhibit SOS 295.
Map that was previously introduced into evidence was the hydrology of the San Bernardino Valley. This map is also at the scale 1 to 62,500, and it covers 30 minutes of longitude and 15 minutes of latitude. And if we go to slide 14, you'll see that the San Bernardino quadrangle that was done in years prior to the 1905 study is the western portion, the 15 by 15 minute map, also at 1 to 62,500. Slide 15 shows you the eastern end of that map, another 15 by 15 minute quadrangle. And the two topographic maps, San Bernardino and Redlands, 15 by 15 minute quadrangles, were used together as a base map in the field by Dr. Mendenhall for his study that was published in 1905. Moving to slide 16, this is a graph from Dr. Mendenhall's report. It shows precipitation in the years that the mapping was going on when the field work was in place. 1893, 1894 for the one quadrangle, 1898 to 1899 for the other quadrangle. And you can see that on the graph, those 2 years happen to be deficit in the amount of total precipitation. And again, the field crews were directed to go out there, observe, and sketch at the time what they saw. So even in years of lower precipitation, the streams as published on the topographic maps were there, they're observed and mapped as indicated, either perennial or intermittent. We'll move to slide 17 and talking about the georeferencing that was mentioned in Mr. Nichols' testimony. Slide 18 will show that each of the quadrangles there had 16 well-defined control points. And their latitude, longitude, intersections, they were the control of the base map and used to map the features. So you have those 16 on each of the maps. And when you merge them together into the 1905 map, that actually gave you 28 control points that were there. But in this case, we're talking about each quadrangle by itself. San Bernardino and Redlands, serving as base maps, have, again, the 16 well-defined control points. And in slide 18, the way that these maps, as were downloaded, I'm sorry, I misspoke, slide 19, please. As these maps were geo-referenced and downloaded, previous testimony, that's these control points were used and to set up a mathematical transformation to geo-referencing. That's going from a paper copy, a scan of that, of just image XY coordinates, to actually convert them to Earth coordinates, known latitude and longitude points. And the whole purpose and the activity that was done was to make these usable in a GIS, but while they're being usable, they were converted in such a way that all the accuracy that was inherent in the printed map was retained, and therefore they should meet national map accuracy standards. So, slide 20. In Mr. Nichols' testimony, there was no firm statement as to georeferencing process. It wasn't discussed as to the origin of the images, the resolution of these, presumed to be raster. You have to have that to transform. Methodology that was used, the number of control points. And were they actually latitude, longitude points, or were they just actually what was known geographic point, and use that as a transformation coordinate pair to go from paper to print? So based on that, I was not able to conclude georeferencing accuracy, and it raises a question about the reliability of those maps. Slide 21, please. The last point that was made was that Strawberry Creek was misaligned, that the Strawberry Creek as drawn and printed in the blue ink on the 1905 map did not align with the topographic contours. And looking at it closely, it is my opinion that that is a printing error. At the time the topographic maps were published, there were three primary printing colors. You had brown for the topography, black for all the latitude, longitude control points and culture, and then blue, cyan for the drainage. When you run it through a printing press, if any of those printing plates are misaligned one to another, it would show apparent discrepancies. And looking at the map that was referenced as having error, there are some misalignments, they don't line up. But when you go back to the original topographic base maps, everything aligns perfectly. The streams correspond correctly with the topography. Going back to the 1905 map on misalignments, it is not just Strawberry Creek that is misaligned. You look at other adjacent creeks like Little Sand Creek, City Creek, and Plunge Creek are all somewhat misaligned uniformly, which leads me to believe that the printing press was not properly aligned when they ran the paper through the press and put on the blue plate for streams and then ran the paper again for the brown ink of contours. They were not positioned correctly. It's standard procedure to, regardless of era, to always proof check that for alignment and printing errors, and it does not appear to have been caught at this time. And on that, I'll conclude my testimony.
And so before we go to cross-ex, Mr. Eller, I just want to be clear. So with this misalignment of the streams, the blue plate on both the San Bernardino quadrangle and the Redlands quadrangle?
No, both of those original topographic maps were correct. It's regarding the plate 12 of water supply paper 142. That's what Mr. Nichols was using and calling out as being misaligned and therefore not reliable.
Got it. And
I
now,
believe that, excuse me, I'm sorry.
yeah, I'm sorry, you probably covered this. I'm just going to ask you rather than read it. So was plate 12 prepared by the Geologic Survey, or was that prepared by some other entity?
Okay, looking back at the records, the best I can tell is no, the survey was conducted by U.S. Geological Survey scientists using the graphic map in the field. The plate itself regarding the printing, it looked like what I can read in that era, and it does, if we want to double check, we can enlarge it. The contract, the engraving itself in the copper plate, the technology that was used to create printing plates at the time, was contracted to a company in Boston and then turned back to the U.S. Geological Survey for printing.
Okay.
But the field work was done using the San Bernardino and Redlands 1905, I'm sorry, topographic quadrangles at the same scale as was published in the geologic study later. And that confirms back to John Wesley Powell's intent to have topographic division, then branch, support the geologic division, do the topographic mapping first, then go in the field and do the geology using those precise maps.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Allard. Does that conclude your summary?
It does.
All right. So does anybody want to?
Mr. Lilly, may I just ask him a couple of questions?
Go ahead.
Okay, so Mr. Allard, then is it your opinion that the 1901 map accurately, sorry, the 1901 Redlands map accurately portrays, sorry, just one moment. If we could pull up SOS 290.
All right, Ms. Mullen, please display exhibit SOS 290. And this is a lot of megabytes, so it'll take a minute to display, so bear with us. All right, we have SOS 290 on the screen. Please ask your question.
Okay. Mr. Allard, does this, in your opinion, accurately portray on the ground observations by USGS scientists of hydrological features that were present in the 1893, 1894 field season?
It's my opinion that it does, yes.
Okay, and if we could pull up SOS 291, please.
Okay, we'll get SOS 291. And just bear with us. It takes a minute for these to load. All right, we have SOS 291 on the screen. You may ask your question.
Okay, Mr. Allard, is it your opinion that this accurately portrays the hydrological features that were present in 1898, 1899 field season as observed by GS scientists?
Yes, in my opinion, yes.
Those are my only questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Allard. Thank you, Ms. Doty. I'm just making some notes here. Bear with me. Does anybody want to ask Mr. Allard cross-examination questions? Please raise your hand if you do. Miss Grady. I see.
May I have just one moment? I apologize.
Yeah, if you want, we can take a break so you can go get your glasses. That's a unnecessary impediment. We don't have to impose that on you.
Yes, can we just take a quick break and come back?
Yeah, let's just take is 3 minutes enough? Yeah, just everybody don't leave, but you can go on mute and turn the camera off. Come back at 10:55. All right, just one moment. We're still waiting for Ms. Doty and Mr. Petrozelli. There's Mr. Petrozelli. There's Ms. Doty. All right, so Ms. Grady, do you, you've had a moment. Do you want to ask Mr. Allard cross-examination questions?
No, thank you.
Does anybody else want to ask Mr. Allard cross-examination questions? All right. Oh, wait, Mr. Petrozelli, your hand just went up. Please go ahead.
Mr. Allard, I had very brief questions. Mr. Lilly, can we put exhibit PT 313 revised on the screen?
We may. Ms. Mullen, see if you can find it and then display exhibit PTB 313 revised.
Could we do, it might be 314, pardon me.
All right, let's try 314.
Yes.
Ms. Mullen, please get exhibit PT 314. All right, so just tell us, Mr. Petrozelli, how much you want us to zoom in or out, and maybe you better tell us what this is.
This is exhibit PT 314. This was sort of an excerpt and blow up from the 1905 USGS map with current points of interest depicted with the green and yellow dots.
Okay, so for Mr. Allard's purposes, the main thing is the base map without the red line and the green and yellow circles is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but anybody, please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is this base map is what he has referred to as plate 12. Is that correct?
I believe, yes.
All right, so and do you want us to zoom out some so you can see more of
please.
it? So Mr. Allard, and I'm just kind of briefly summarizing, we've had a lot of days of testimony, but this is basically plate 12 with the red line has been added and the green and yellow circles have been added. So with that, Mr. Petrozelli, please ask your question.
Mr. Allard, could you, and Mr. Lilly, if you don't think this is necessary or if it's been explained, we've been through a lot. I can't recall if it's something we've covered. Mr. Allard, can you explain what a solid blue line represents on a topographic map?
A perennial stream.
Okay. And what does that mean?
There's flow in the channel year round.
Okay. And what does a dashed blue line represent?
Intermittent stream. That's there's water in the channel, not on a continuous basis.
Okay. And Mr. Lilly, those were the only questions I have.
All right, thank you, Mr. Petrozelli. Ms. Mullen, you may take down exhibit PT 314. I didn't see any other hands. So Ms. Doty, do you want to, I assume there's not going to be any redirect based on those, because there only were those two short questions for Mr. Petrozelli. Do you want to offer your exhibits SOS 288 through 301 into evidence at this time?
I do.
All right, are there any objections to SOS 288 through SOS 301? All right, Ms. Grady.
I would just say none except those already stated.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Ms. Grady has previously stated some objections that I've ruled on. Hearing no other objections, we will receive exhibits SOS 288 through SOS 301 into evidence. And with that, Mr. Allard, you are done. Thank you. You certainly can keep listening if you want, but your testimony is completed. Thank you very much for appearing this morning.
All right, thank you.
All right. So what we're going to do, we'll go forward with Mr. Nichols' rebuttal, his response to Mr. Allard's testimony, which is exhibit BTB 46. Let me just get my papers here in order. And I'll just say, Mr. Nichols, is exhibit BTB 46 your written proposed test or your testimony for today in response to Mr. Allard's testimony?
Yes.
All right, so Ms. Grady, again, we're this is pretty narrow, but I'll give you 10 minutes if you need it to ask Mr. Nichols to summarize Exhibit BTB 46.
Thank you, Mr. Lilly. And I will simply ask Mr. Nichols to please briefly summarize his testimony.
Thank you. I just have a couple of points that I would like to describe with regards to Mr. Allard's testimony. He testified that the apparent error on the 1905 hydrologic map, which I believe was initially introduced as SOS 91, is the result of misaligned printing plates with regards to publication of that map, in that the earlier base map, which was a topographic map, had the plates properly aligned. For the purpose of my use of that map, I was, of course, evaluating.
Wait, Mr. Nichols, slow down, please. It's very important. I want to hear it. The court reporter wants to get it down. So turn it back to 80% and please proceed. Thank you.
I will. My reason for looking at this map in the first place was the fact that the prosecution team had used it to create a composite map that we see in Exhibit PT 314. And regardless of the source of the errors for the misalignment of the flow symbology with the creek channel, regardless of the source of those errors, the fact remains that that error was included in the final map and then subsequently carried into prosecution team Exhibit 314. So any evaluations made with regards to the proximity of features in the canyon to that creek channel or to that hydrologic symbol of intermittent stream are inaccurate because they're based on that 1905 map, which included the inaccuracy. I don't dispute the earlier topographic mapping that had that symbology aligned. But it does raise a question for me with regards to Mr. Allard's testimony regarding the accuracy of the placement of those symbols. And of course, the exercise that I went through was to examine intermittent creek streams that were mapped on the 1905 hydrologic map in adjacent canyons to Strawberry Canyon, in East Twin Creek and West Fork City Creek canyons, to look at the differences through time and how that symbology was applied in those canyons. And what we see is that the intermittent stream symbols used on the 1905 hydrologic map in the adjacent canyons disappeared in subsequent years. Now, Mr. Allard has testified that he feels that the intermittent stream symbology was correctly and accurately applied on the base maps that were developed before the 1905 hydrologic map. However, we see that symbology changes through the years. A key point of my testimony is we don't know what those changes are resulting from, but that adjacent canyons don't have points of diversion that are removing water from those canyons. And so the necessary conclusion is that there's some change in the reason or manner that those were mapped. Mr. Allard also discusses georeferencing. In particular, the georeference products that I produced were for the purpose of plotting the National Hydrologic Data Set on subsequent topographic maps from the 1953-1954 period up to 2018. And the accuracy of that georeferencing does not affect my testimony with regards to the number of intermittent streams shown. The purpose of my map comparison was to look at where intermittent streams were mapped and where they subsequently disappeared, rather than whether or not the stream channels were aligned. Mr. Allard points to one example in my testimony where I identify the stream symbology as plotting above the stream channel by 150 feet or so. That reference is to prosecution team Exhibit 314, rather than to any georeferencing that I did. And so consequently, if there's a challenge with georeferencing in that product, it originated with others. That concludes my summary.
Thank you, Mr. Nichols. I got into somehow I shifted views there. Does anybody have any cross-examination questions for Mr. Nichols regarding Exhibit BTB 46. Mr. Petrozelli and Ms. Doty, I see your hands are up. Anybody else?
I actually don't have a cross-examination question. I don't, my question or my comment is that I don't see that this has been uploaded to the, or is available on the FTP. I've been looking, but I haven't been able to find it yet. I saw proof of service for paper copies, but I've been unable to find any other service or availability of this document.
That was also my comment, and my assistant has just said that it's not there. So we were unable to prepare for this testimony, unfortunately.
Uh-oh. That's not good.
That was my experience as well, with Lisa Belenke. Thank you.
This probably has something to do with the fact we had a fairly short turnaround time, but that's we still should have it up there. Let me just see whether it's up there now. Oh no, we only have through 45. So let's see whether 46 is. Let me just see if it's, for some reason I got it. I may have just pulled it with it from the uploads. Yes, okay, I'm gonna just move it over here right now. That was a mistake on my part. Or an omission, I should say, by my office, just to be more accurate. Bear with me, it just takes a moment to click here. Okay, so let's just take one moment here and everybody can check. It should now be on the FTP upload, in the upload folder in the Blue Triton exhibits, exhibit BTB 46. So can somebody check and see if it has appeared there? Mr. Petrozelli, I'm counting on you. Is it there now? I see a nod. Can you go off mute and tell me?
It's there.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So here's what I'm going to do. What happened was, I'm trying to wrap this all up today and tomorrow, hopefully today. So the deadline was last Thursday, and we were busy with another hearing, and for whatever reason, we just missed it, and I apologize. So what I suggest we do is everybody can, it's only 4 pages long. You can either print it or read it however you want. And we'll take a longer break. Maybe we'll do this over the lunch break, and then people can develop if they have any cross-examination questions for Mr. Nichols. Again, just limited to exhibit BTB 46. So in the meantime, Ms. Grady, have you heard, I'm sorry, I've lost the name of Mr. Grunwald. Have we heard back from Mr. Grunwald yet?
I don't have an update from him yet, so it might be most efficient just to push all this a little later in the afternoon.
All right, let's do this. We can definitely do the cross-ex of Mr. Nichols at 1 o'clock. So let's take a longer than usual lunch break. And we'll come back at 1 o'clock. We'll start with cross-examination of Mr. Nichols regarding exhibit BTB 46. I expect we'll finish that before 2 o'clock. If we finish it, and then we'll also get a report from Ms. Grady regarding Mr. Grunwald's availability. I suspect we may be done with Mr. Nichols by like 1:30, and if Mr. Grunwald's available, we'll do that then. If necessary, we can have his, actually, but to help him and us all plan, let's plan Mr. Nichols at 1 o'clock and Mr. Grunwald at 2:30, since I have a part of that board member briefing I mentioned from 2 to 2:30. And those, I think, are the last 2 things we have to cover. Is that correct? Is there anything else? I mean, we have to talk about closing briefs, and we will do that. But is there anything else we need to cover? All right, I'm not seeing any hands come up. So let's plan to do that. Back at 1 o'clock for cross-examination, Mr. Nichols regarding VTB 46. Plan to finish that before 2. I don't think we will have any problem doing that. And then we'll come back at 2:30 for Mr. Grunwald for direct and cross-examination. And then we'll talk about a schedule for filing closing briefs. And anything else to talk about today? This morning. Seeing no hands, a reminder, you do need to log off now and then log back on because we have a different session that we will do starting at 1 p.m. So thank you all. Enjoy your longer than usual lunch break. We'll be back at 1 p.m. Thank you.